What should you do if you only have 3 months left in your PhD? In this video, I'm going to share my essential tips to help you through those final months. But first, if we haven't met before, my name is James Hayton, and for the last 10 years, I've been a full-time PhD coach, helping students from all kinds of academic backgrounds from all over the world to get through the PhD with less stress, and in some cases, even to enjoy the process. I'll say more about what I do at the end of this video, but for now, back to the question. So to finish your PhD, you need to stop adding more content, adding more new stuff, and consolidate what you have. So throughout your PhD, everything that you do will tend to create more work. It will tend to create more open questions. So for example, every time you read an individual research paper, that paper might have 30 references. So that creates more reading. Reading one paper creates 30 more potentially that you could read. And of course, each of those papers has more references, so you can see how it exponentially grows. Every experiment that you do will raise more questions, create more analysis. So the number of things that you could potentially do tends to increase and increase and increase over time. But in order to finish, all of that needs to be tied up in this nice, neat package. So there has to come a point where you stop exploring new things, where you stop adding more potential new questions, and you just start writing what you have. There has to be that cutoff point. Now, sometimes people find this difficult because there's always more that you could potentially read, but there's no way around this. So what we need to do is start looking at what you have. So the first question that I always ask people in this situation is, have you gathered at least all of your data? Have you stopped gathering new information, new raw data? And then the second question is, have you actually looked at that data? Have you got it into a form that you can actually analyze it and present it to somebody else? And that is the bare minimum that you need in order to be able to write with confidence and start finishing off those chapters. If you're still gathering more data, then the content of your chapters could change because you don't know what the results are going to be. Now, if you haven't reached that point yet, if you're still gathering new data, you either need to stop, or if it's absolutely essential, if there's no way that you can finish without getting that extra data, probably you need to get an extension, and it's good to inquire about that as early as possible. Don't wait for the last minute. Okay? You need to have the data before you're writing. Now, sometimes people get caught in the trap of writing chapters and trying to get those sort of finished and then chuck the data in at the end. That is a really bad idea. You need the data first so you know what you're going to say so that you can write with confidence. The number of times I've seen people overcommit to the answer that they expect in their writing, it doesn't end well, generally speaking. So if you need more time to gather that data, if that's absolutely essential, try and seek that extra time. But assuming you have the data that you need, that you've stopped your data collection, the second question is, have you looked at it? So if you have, for example, interview data, you need to make sure that that is transcribed, that it's in a form that you can actually use. If you haven't done that, that needs to be your top priority. Stop doing everything else, get that data into a usable form. Now, I often use interview transcripts as an example because it's kind of easy to understand, but it applies to anything. In my own case, in my own PhD, this meant going through thousands of microscope images, picking out the ones that I wanted to use, doing initial analysis, making sure that I knew what I had, knew what I was going to present, so that I could go into the writing with a bit more confidence, knowing where I was going. It's extremely difficult to write if you don't know what the results are actually going to say. The next thing to do is to simplify as much as possible. So what a lot of people do is try and get everything that they've done down onto the page and then try and cut it down to, what they actually need or what is actually useful. That takes a really long time, but it's much better if you can simplify in advance, decide in advance, do a little bit of cutting in advance before you start writing. It will save you a huge amount of time. So instead of thinking about the maximum and presenting everything, think about the minimum. What are the best results that you have? If you only had to keep 10% or 20% of everything that you've done, what would be those essential things that you absolutely cannot remove? Focus on those things rather than trying to cram everything in. People think often that adding more makes a thesis stronger, but often that actually dilutes the quality. If you add more, you have more weaker material and the stronger stuff gets kind of hidden. Whereas if you focus on the strongest material that you have, then your thesis will naturally be stronger. Now, in deciding how to simplify and what material you want to stick with, think about what are your strongest results, but also where are you strongest? Where is your strongest kind of understanding? So in all the time that you spent in your PhD, where are you most confident? Focus on that stuff instead of trying to pull in more things just to impress the examiner. Now you may find this difficult, but it's really important to be decisive. And then if you have time, you can always add more stuff later. But for the meantime, try and focus on that minimum core strongest content. The next thing to do is to work out a rough timeline. Now, it's really important here that you don't overplan. You don't spend ages trying to create this amazingly detailed timeline because people very, very rarely stick to it. When you create a timeline, it's often based on this kind of best imaginable productivity, but it creates this burden that people often find it very, very difficult to live up to. All you need is a rough timeline. The way to create it is to figure out roughly how many chapters you will have. So create a rough outline of chapter 1 will cover this, chapter 2 will cover this. When you know how many chapters you will have, you simply take the time you have available. So let's say you've got 6 chapters in 3 months. Then you know that that is roughly 1 chapter every 2 weeks that you need to produce. And if you want to stick to that timeline of a chapter every 2 weeks, then what you have to do is adjust what you're doing based on that time and based on how quickly you are going. And this is another reason why it's important not to have a super detailed plan. Because if you start writing and you're 1 week in and you realize, okay, there's this massive chunk of work that I'm just not going to have time to do if I'm to meet that deadline by the end of next week, then sometimes you have to cut that stuff and focus on, again, your strongest material, the core content. Or you might find that you're going through quite quickly, and then you've got time to incorporate some of those extra kind of bonus elements. But if you want to make that deadline, the deadline has to influence the decisions that you're making on a day-to-day basis. If the first chapter takes you twice as long as it should, then obviously you're reducing the amount of time that you have for the remaining chapters. And how are you going to find the time to adjust? So you need to be adjusting as you go, changing some of the decisions, changing the plan in response to the time that's passing, in response to your pace. And if it looks like it's just not possible, again, maybe you need to ask for an extension, and it's better to do that early than to leave it to the very last minute. So once you actually start writing, generally speaking, I advise that you start with the introduction. Now, this goes against what a lot of people advise. A lot of people say that you should write the introduction at the end. But if you write the introduction at the beginning, it forces you to commit to this is the project, these are the questions that I'm going to answer. And let's face it, 3 months from the submission, you should know what research questions you're trying to answer. That should not change at this point. If it is changing, then there is quite a serious problem, which is not fixed by writing the introduction at the end. So you should be able to write the introduction at the beginning. And what that does is it fixes in your mind, this is what I'm going to do. But also it means that you are following the same logical process as your reader. If you start somewhere in the middle, often what I find is that people will start writing, let's say, chapter 3, and then they're putting in all sorts of stuff that needs to be in the introduction, justifying the research, all of these other things, background, theory, and whatever else. But that should have already been established in the introduction. So they're trying to get these things out because they need to be there for the rest of the material to make sense. And then it all ends up in this kind of jumbled up mess. So this may sound counterintuitive, but I think it's better to slow down, write the introduction, and then you know what the reader has already read and you don't need to repeat that stuff. And if you work in sequence throughout the thesis, finishing 1 chapter at a time, you always know what you've already told the reader and you don't need to repeat. The other advantage of starting with the introduction and working in sequence is that you never have to decide what you're working on. If you just decide randomly, I'm going to work on this chapter, often what will happen is you'll run into a block and then you'll jump to another section and then you'll jump to another section, you jump to another section. But one thing that is really important and often makes the difference between finishing on time or not is that you deal with the problems that arise. So if you're working on the introduction and you face some kind of difficulty, let's say it's defining your research questions or finding the right phrasing for your research questions, stay with that problem until you find a solution. What you want to try to do is get each section that you're working on, every subsection that you're working on, into a submittable state. That means including all of the references, all of the formatting, making all of the decisions that need to be made, and then moving on to the next section. If you don't do this, then all you're doing is saving that problem for later. So let's say, again, I'll stick with the same example. You're defining your research questions. You're trying to find that right phrasing. If you find that difficult and you just leave it because you want to keep the word count increasing, you want to keep that productivity, that decision is unmade. And then you hit another block and then you leave that because you want to keep the word count increasing. And then that's another decision that's not made. And then you find you're in the final weeks and all you have left is all the most difficult stuff that you left for later. And that is going to be an incredibly stressful time. So face the discomfort of making a decision about that particular problem, stay with it until you make a decision, and then move on. And then you kind of train the confidence that you can actually deal with these things. And sometimes you'll have to slow down, but then of course you'll speed up again once that decision is made and you move into a slightly easier phase. So try and work in sequence, face whatever problems come up, deal with them as they arise, and don't save them for later, because with 3 months left, there isn't much later to spend on that particular problem. So of course, if you do it this way, your speed will vary. You will not have the same pace all the time. You will slow down, you will speed up. And that's okay, as long as your average speed means that you're progressing and that you're producing things. So sometimes you might fall into a bit of a trap where you're just being too indecisive, you're going too slowly, and then maybe you need to increase the priority of productivity and the speed. So you can set yourself a target of, say, writing 100 words in the next hour. So you prioritize speed a little bit more to speed up. And then you face another problem and you kind of slow down again, and then you speed up again. So you can balance whether you're prioritizing putting a lot of time and care into this particular problem. But if you're putting too much time and you're getting a little bit too perfectionist, you can lean towards productivity and speed. What you don't want to do is just go speed, churn out 10,000 words a day, and then find you have this massive mess. So let your pace vary. And if you're going too slowly, you can correct towards speed. But then if you're finding you're going too fast, I would suggest slowing down and dealing with the problems that arise. So it's kind of a balance. So sometimes, when I talk about these things, people say, oh, that's perfectionism, and that you have to go as fast as you can and just get words down on the page and just, sort it all out later. Perfectionism, excessive perfectionism is a bad thing, but excessive carelessness and just writing in a panic is not a solution to that. We want to find kind of a balance. It's a bit of a range. Sometimes you slow down, sometimes you speed up. Another important tip related to this, again, which you might find a little bit difficult if you're tempted to start racing ahead and there's loads of pressure to be producing, but it's super important to read what you've written on a regular basis. Don't just wait until you've got a full draft of a chapter before you read over what you've written. Everything that you write exists in the context of what you've said before. And it's really important then that you know what it is that you've actually said, partly to make sure that it's well structured, but also to make sure that you're not repeating yourself excessively. And it also means that you can do some of the editing and fix any typos and that kind of thing as you're going, rather than saving it all up for the end. So that's it from me. I hope you like this video. If you do, please give it a thumbs up because that helps other people to find it. Also, if you like these videos, please do subscribe and hit the bell so you get notified when new videos appear. And if you'd like more detailed guidance, check out my websites. There are two of them. There's jameshaytonphd.com, where I've got hundreds of blog posts on everything PhD related, and also the PhD Academy, which is www.phd.academy. I'll put a link in the description below. And that's where we've got detailed courses. We do Zoom calls. We've got a whole community of PhD students as well. Check it out with the links below. That's it from me, and I'll see you next time.